some stability in Syria. Now, our first speaker, who I'll be introducing now, is Tim Llewellyn, who was a BBC Middle East correspondent and covered the Lebanon Civil War, the Syrian interventions, and the 2 Israeli invasions of Lebanon, the Iranian Revolution of 1978 to 1980, the Iran-Iraq War, the first Gulf War from Baghdad and Amman, he reported from there, and the continuing Palestinian-Israeli struggle from his first assignment in the Middle East with BBC in 1974 until today. He is also the author of Spirit of the Phoenix, Beirut and the Story of Lebanon, published by IB Taurus in 2010. Now, do you have any copies of your book? No, you don't. Well,
sold out.
I would recommend you ask Tim later and you can get copies of his book. So, Tim, thank you. So you're going to start us off. And obviously, I mean, all of us must find that when we look at the headlines and we see the horrible photographs, I certainly get this feeling of helplessness. And I myself am wondering if from this conversation and this discussion today, we can get some understanding of how we reach this stage and were there any points in which we could have avoided this. Had the people who'd started the uprising, had they known what was happening today, would they have taken a different course? Should the West have done something earlier or not? So I leave it to you, Tim, to sort of set the scene and explain what's happening up to now. Thank you.
Well, Rita's given me a very easy lead-in, actually, the answer to those 2 questions.
Excuse me, Mr. Manager, can I ask that I can stand up or speak quite loud, so
You can't hear.
On the left here, would you like to come to the left?
Would you prefer me to stand up?
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
some people, thank you, Tim.
Take more than one. I just wanted to say Rita gave me a very easy lead-in, really. She said, would the people originally in Daraa, southern Syria, who rose up against the regime, would they have done anything different if they'd known how it would all turn out? The answer to that is quite simple, no. That was an uprising waiting to happen. How it's turned out is another story. I forget what the second point was. What was the second
Now,
question?
was there anything that we could
Oh, well, should the
find out?
West have intervened earlier? The answer to that is a flat no. The West should stay out of it, totally, except as a bringer of aid and relief to the poor people who've been forced to leave Syria and the people in Syria who are suffering. What I want to do is just very briefly, and it is going to have to be brief, try and explain really how we got here. Why Syria is to some extent in the situation it is today. And I want to go back to the end of the First World War. When the First World War ended, the 2 colonial powers, remaining colonial powers and empirical powers, Britain and France, carved up the Middle East, as I think you all know. Syria, Greater Syria, was savagely truncated by the colonial powers, the territory of Palestine being given to the British as a mandate, and Iraq being given to the British also as a mandate by the League of Nations. They weren't actually given, they were acquired by the British in subtle, devious and illegal ways, but that's another story. The French were given Syria and Lebanon. And what the French proceeded to do immediately was what all colonial powers do in these circumstances, and it was very easy to do in an area like Greater Syria, where there were different groups, different tribes, different religions, different ethnic groupings, which had, to some extent, to a large extent, lived in harmony under the Ottoman Empire, not completely, but to a great degree in this greater Syrian landscape. What the French did was, first of all, truncate Greater Syria by carving off a greater version of Lebanon than had existed before, and making the Christian Maronites rulers, basically, or in a predominant position, over a much larger expanse of Lebanon than had been the case under the Ottoman Empire of Shia and Sunni Muslims. That meant complications were to come ahead. Within Syria, what the French did, very savagely, was to truncate Syria within itself. And there are many different examples of this. Many different regions were given a great deal of autonomy under French rule. But one area which was given autonomy almost straight away, and that autonomy was strengthened as French rule went on, was the Alawite area in northwest Syria. And the Alawite area contained people who were probably some of the least well-off, prosperous, and advanced of the Syrian area, and therefore, over time, the Alawites tended to make their career, as people from poor areas quite often do, in the army and the security services. The French not only truncated and divided Syria and instituted a process of divide and rule which set minority against minority, they also left the country at the end of the Second World War after a fierce bombardment of Damascus in 1946. They left Syria virtually broke. We then move on to the period after this, after the French mandate ended. Syria was in constant confusion for the next 20 or 30 years. First of all, there was the disastrous creation of Israel, which of course humiliated and distressed Syria. Syria was part of the forces that were trying to protect the Palestinians and failed miserably. And as Arab nationalism grew in the area, the West saw Syria as a kind of ally of communism. Therefore, Syria has always, to some extent, been under Western aggression, under Western suspicion. Of course, Arab nationalism had nothing basically to do with communism, but in the Cold War period between the end of the Second World War and 1990s, the Syrians were seen as being part of this phalanx. In other words, if you didn't join with the West, you were against and you were therefore pro-Soviet. This had grave consequences for Syria's own stability. There was a series of coups and counter-coups in Syria up until the point in the 1960s when the Ba'ath Party, a secular Arab nationalist type party, took over, and the Syrians began to have some sort of stability, which was confirmed when President Assad, the ruler of Syria from 1970, took over, instituted a period of stable rule, and because he was from a minority, aroused a lot of opposition from seriously Islamic groups. There was an uprising in Syria in the 1970s, a serious one, a series of assassinations of people from all groups, but especially Alawites, culminating in a massacre, a cold-blooded massacre of army cadets at the artillery school in Aleppo in 1981. And this, in turn, this long period of instability inside Syria triggered a massive reaction by Assad himself, who his forces besieged and attacked the city of Hama, which was seen as a source and a hotbed of Islamic extremism, Muslim brothers and their associates. And tens of thousands of people were slaughtered in this attack. So you can see from this very, very variegated past that inside Syria itself, let alone next door Lebanon, with which Syria has been concerned a great deal in trying to, well, both rule and maintain stability. We could argue about that, but Syria, of course, has an interest in Lebanon and has had an interest in Lebanon. You can see that in Syria, there has been nothing but instability ever since the French started to rule it in 1920, in fact, when the mandate came into force. Therefore, there is a fantastic fear inside Syria of instability, and a fantastic fear that however much this government, this regime, odious in many ways as it is, I hold no brief for it, I'm not condoning it, I'm just trying to explain how it's arrived. And many people within Syria are still extremely doubtful about what would replace the current regime, foul though it may well be. The minorities, apart from the Alawites, Christians, Druze, Armenians, Ismailis, all kinds of different groups, are very much dependent on the status quo, that's to say, a secular state tolerant of all minorities. And so are many of the majority Sunni Muslims who are part of the wealthy middle class or part of the establishment, but also ordinary middle class Muslims who fear instability and the threat of some bizarre kind of Islamic takeover or chaos, which is what we have at present. So I'm saying this to explain that there is more support, or more support has grown for the regime, willy-nilly, because the alternative looks to be incoherent, dangerous, and unknown. One other point I think we should remember is that when this upheaval started in 2011, the West saw a golden opportunity, and it wasn't talked about that much in the media here, but it's terribly important to understand this. that if Syria could be broken on this wheel of revolution, nobody quite knew how, but if the regime could be removed, and this is most important, in fact, in the strategic view of the area, if this Syrian regime could be removed, it would effectively, or this was the aim, effectively break the link between Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon, a thorn in the side of the Israelis, and the only existing force really in the Middle East that causes the Israelis any concern. If you broke that link between Iran and Syria, if you broke the Syrian link between Iran and Hezbollah, broke that alliance for many reasons, the Iranian position would be seriously weakened, and therefore the West saw an opportunity there, and the opportunity, alas for the West, has not presented itself in a real way. Iran's commitment to Syria has been bolstered and reinforced. Hezbollah is fighting alongside the Assad regime to great effect inside Syria, and to some extent now inside Lebanon as well. As I say, I'm not making a judgment about this, but it is a fact. And the entry of Hezbollah and Iranian forces into the dispute that's going on, the civil war, the strife, the regional war that's going on inside Lebanon, has to some extent reversed the fortunes of war for the regime. And it's now very difficult to see that in the very near future, or in any future, that this regime is going to be an easy pushover. The other point, of course, is that there are two other things to remember very quickly. The Iranians and the Americans seem to be on the verge of some kind of relationship, which may well be a key to seeing a way forward in this dispute. We don't know, but it's a hopeful sign, and there aren't many. On the other hand, the United States' relationship with Russia is worsening. The stupid row over Crimea has put Russia's backs up. So, although I don't doubt that Russia's commitment to Syria and the present regime there was long-lasting and real, this will redetermine Putin in his support for Syria. So, in other words, what we have, I think, is a great question mark over Syria. The problem with the Arab uprising is, all of the Arab uprisings has been this, and it's quite simple, really, is that the uprisings were marvelous. They showed that the Arabs still had a will, the aspiration to shed themselves, to rid themselves of decades of colonial and imperial rule and interference, of their own dictators of one sort or another, whether it was Gaddafi, Mubarak, or Assad. The problem has been throughout all these uprisings, we see it now in Egypt, is that these forces of good, if you like, against these regimes are not coherent forces. They do not produce a political machine that can replace the existing system. That is going to take a long time to evolve and to develop. And I think that's the gravest problem that the Middle East faces, is that it's going to be a long time for these things, for these units, these institutions, to evolve in such a way. And as we've seen in Iraq, you take away the strong man at the top, what you leave behind when he goes, and we're glad to see the back of him or them, is chaos. That's all I'm going to say at the moment. Just one thing that always strikes me again about the Western coverage, it's something to bear in mind, is that generally speaking, the Western media and the Western politicians have supported the Arab uprisings, but I noticed that nothing was ever said, no comparison was ever made with the state of the Palestinians in Israel. Nobody ever talked about an uprising by the Palestinians, or why there wasn't one, or what would happen if there was one. If there was an uprising on the Egyptian or Syrian scale against the Israeli government, which is the most oppressive of all the Middle East governments when it comes to Arabs, if there was an uprising against that government in Israel, what would the West's attitude to be towards that? Would there be the cheering and the support and the rolling and positive coverage on the BBC that we've seen in Egypt, Libya, Iraq, and now in Syria? I don't think so. Thank you.